The Voice from Chicago proudly presents World of Warcraft, Arthas, The Rise of the Lich King. Written by Christy Golden. Voiced over by Kyle Hedlund. Prologue the Dreaming. The wind shrieked like a child in pain. The herd of shovel-tusk huddled together for warmth, their thick shaggy coats protecting them from the worst of the storm. They formed a circle with the calves shivering and bleeding in the center. Their heads, each crowned with a massive antler, drooped toward the snow-covered earth, eyes shut against the whirling snow. Their own breath frosted their muzzles as they planted themselves and endured. In their various dens, the wolves and bears waited out the storms, one with the comfort of their pack, the other solitary and resigned. Whatever their hunger, nothing would drive them forth until after the keening wind had ceased its weeping and the blinding snow had worn itself out. The wind, roaring in from the ocean to beat at the village of Kamagua, tore at the hides that stretched over frames made of the bones of great sea creatures. When the storm passed, the Tuskar, whose home this has been for years uncounted, knew that they would need to repair or replace nets and traps. Their dwellings, sturdy though they were always harmed when this storm descended. They had all gathered inside the large group dwelling that had been dug deep into the earth, lacing the flaps tight against the storm and lighting smoky oil lamps. Elder Atuik waited in stoic silence. He had seen many of these storms over the last 7 years. Long had he lived, the length and yellowness of his tusks and the wrinkles of his brown skin testament to that fact. But these storms were more than natural. He glanced at the young ones, shivering not with cold, not the Tuskar, but with fear.
"He dreams,"
one of them murmured, eyes bright, whiskers bristling.
"Silence!"
snapped Atuik, more gruffly than he had intended. The child, startled, fell silent, and once again the only sound was the aching sob of the snow and wind. It rose like the smoke, the deep bellowing noise, wordless but full of meaning, a chant carried by dozen voices. The sound of drums and rattles and bones striking bone formed a fierce undercurrent to the wordless call. The worst of the wind's anger was deflected from the Tanaka village by a circle of posts and hides, and the lodges, their curving roofs arching over a large interior space in defiance of the hardships of this land, were strong. Over the sound of deep and ancient ritual, the wind's cry could still be heard. The dancer, a shaman by the name of Kamaku, missed a step and his hoofs struck awkwardly. He recovered and continued. Focus. It was all about focus. It was how one harnessed the elements and wrung from their obedience. It was how his people survived in a land that was harsh and unforgiving. Sweat dampened and darkened his fur as he danced. His large brown eyes were closed in concentration. His hooves again finding their powerful rhythm. He tossed his head, short horns stabbing the air, tail twitching. Others danced beside him. Their body heat and that of the fire burning brightly despite the flakes and wind drifting down from the smoke hole in the roof kept the lodge warm and comfortable. They all knew what was transpiring outside. They could not control these winds and snow as they could ordinarily such things. No, this was his doing. But they could dance and feast and laugh in defiance of the onslaught. They were Tanaka. They would endure. The world was blue and white and raging outside, but inside the great hall the air was warm and still. A fireplace tall enough for a man to stand in was filled with thick logs, the crackling of their burning the only noise. Over the ornately decorated mantel, carved with images of fantastical creatures, the giant antler of a shovel-tusk was mounted. Carved dragon heads serve as sconces holding torches with flames burning bright.
Heavy beams supported the feast hall that could have housed dozens, the warm orange hue of the fires chasing away the shadows to hide on the corners. The cold stone of the floor was softened and warmed by thick pelts of polar bears, shovel tusks, and other creatures. A table, long and heavy and carved, occupied most of the space in the room. It could have hosted 36 easily. Only 3 figures sat at the table now: a man, an orc, and a boy. None of it was real, of course. The man who sat at the place of honor at the table, slightly elevated before the other 2 in a mammoth carved chair that was not quite a throne, understood this. He was dreaming. He had been dreaming for a long, long time. The hall, the shovel-tusk trophies, the fire, the table, the orc and the boy were all simply part of his dreaming. The orc on his left was elderly, but still powerful. The orange fire and torchlit flickered off the ghastly image he bore on his heavy-jawed face, that of a skull painted on. He had been a shaman, able to direct and wield vast powers, and even now, even just as a figment of the man's imagination, he was imitating. The boy was not. Once he might have been a handsome child with a wide sea-green eyes, fair features, and golden hair. But once was not now. The boy was sick. He was thin, so emaciated that his bones seemed to threaten to slice through the skin. The once bright eyes were dimmed and sunken, a thin film covering them. Pustules marked his skin, bursting and oozing forth a green fluid. Breathing seemed difficult, and the child's chest hitched in little panting gasps. The man thought he could almost see the labored thumping of a heart that should have faltered long ago, but persisted in continuing to beat.
"He is still here,"
the orc said, stabbing a finger in the boy's direction. "He will not last," the man said. As if to confirm the words, the boy began to cough. Blood and mucus spattered the table in front of him, and he wiped a thin arm clad in rotting finery across his pale mouth. He drew breath to speak in a halting voice, the effort obviously taxing him.
"You have not yet won him, and I will prove it to you." "You are foolish as you are stubborn,"
the orc growled.
"That battle was won long ago."
The man's hands tightened on the arms of his chair as he listened to both of them. This has been a recurring dream for over the last few years. He found it now more tiresome than entertaining. "I grow weary of the struggle. Let us end this, once and for all." The boy coughed again, but did not quail from the orc's regard. Slowly, with dignity, he straightened, his milky eyes darting from the orc to the man.
"Yes,"
the orc said.
"This serves nothing. Soon it will be time to awaken. Awaken and move forward into this world once more."
He turned to the man, his eyes gleaming.
"Walk again the path you have taken."
The skull seemed to detach itself from his face, hovering above it like another entity, and the room changed with its movement. The carved sconces that a moment before were simple wooden dragons undulated and rippled, coming to life, the torches in their mouths flaring and casting grotesque dancing shadows as they shook their heads. The wind screamed outside, and the door to the hall slammed open. Snow whirled around the 3 figures. The man spread his arms and let the freezing wind wrap about him like a cloak. The orc laughed, the skull floating over his face, issuing its own manic peals of mirth.
"Let me show you that your destiny lies with me, and you can only know true power through eliminating him."
The boy, fragile and slight, had been knocked out of his chair by the violent gusts of frigid air. Now he propped himself up with an effort, shaking, his breaths coming in small puffs as he struggled to climb back into his chair. He threw the man a look of hope, fear, and odd determination.
"All is not lost,"
he whispered, and somehow, despite the orc and the skull's laughter, despite the shrieking of the wind, the man heard him. End of Prologue. Next week, Part 1, The Golden Boy, Chapter 1.